Hi, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to invite you to tonight's panel, Weathering the Storm of Climate Risk. I'd like to tell you about some upcoming events you may be interested in. On Thursdays, we have our Exploring the Power of Mindfulness seminars. On Fridays, we have our Coding for ERM seminars. And on Saturdays, we have both our IQRM and Intro to Finance seminars. On March 19th is our next featured alumni series panel. On March 11th is our CRO Spotlight series with Senthil Kumar of BNY Mellon. And on April 4th, we have a panel on how good are your risk disclosures. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Mike LeBrock. Mike.
Thank you, Jay. And hello, everybody. So my name is Michael LeBrock. Just a little bit about my background. I'm currently a lecturer at Columbia ERM program. I've been for the last 4+ years. I also serve as managing director, head of credit risk and systemic risk for the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, where I've been working for approximately the last 10 years. One of my main responsibilities is for identifying and monitoring potential systemic threats to DTCC and the industry. So this topic tonight is definitely right in the type of things that I cover day to day. So I'm really looking forward to this. Next, Teresa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I'd be happy to. Good evening. Thanks for having me. My name is Teresa Parashak, and I'm a member of DTCC's government relations team. I am based in Jersey City, and I work with our Washington, D.C. office. And DTCC, as Mike just said, is the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. And my role there is specifically focusing on U.S. government relations activity impacting DTCC. And in terms of ESG and climate risk, from a DTCC GR standpoint, we're really in monitoring mode and we're watching these events as they unfold. So thanks again for having me today.
Lisa?
Thanks, Mike. My name is Lisa Ponte. I am the Vice President of Educational Outreach for the Global Association of Risk Professionals, Garp. I'm a former academic and a former banker. But with Garp, I am predominantly involved with our university relationships. I establish partnerships in risk education and work with students and university groups to talk about financial risk as part of our financial risk manager program, as well as sustainability and climate risk for our SCR certificate program.
Last but not least, Paul.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Paul Washington. I'm Executive Director of something called the ESG Center at the Conference Board. The Conference Board is the world's leading nonpartisan nonprofit think tank dedicated to serving business and society. We've been around for over a century. The ESG Center focuses on providing insights in corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. Before joining the Conference Board, I was kind of like a walking risk. So I entered the banking business in 1989, just as the S&L crisis hit. Then after law school, went to work at what was then Time Warner, and was there for a couple of years before the AOL Time Warner merger happened, which was the greatest destruction of shareholder value in the history of the world until General Electric beat us. So I think I have some personal qualifications to talk tonight.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to all the panelists for being here. I appreciate it. So why are we talking about climate risk tonight? Historically, concerns related to climate change were mostly limited to the environmentalist community. But in recent years, as more and more data and research has been taking place on the topic, there's really a growing agreement among all stakeholders who are involved in climate risk or impacted by climate risk in one way or another, that this risk now represents a global systemic threat. Now, there's many different aspects to climate risk, as you'll hear tonight. Two of the most commonly cited areas are physical risks and transition risks, and we'll be exploring those in more detail. And we'll also shed some light on some new regulatory rules and policymaking initiatives published by organizations such as BIS, the European Banking Commission, And we're also going to talk about some trends in stress testing efforts to help the banking community and others kind of get ahead of and predict some of these risks. So I thought, to say, one picture is worth 1,000 words, and this might be it. This just shows the annual carbon emissions from fossil fuels by region, over the last couple of hundred years. But if you just look at 1950 to current day, it's approximately a 7-fold increase in emissions. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist, as I say, to just extrapolate this. If this continues at this pace, this can really have catastrophic effects on the world. So I thought this was a very eye-opening slide for myself and good way to start the discussion. So before we get into the questions, just a little bit of backdrop. I mentioned we're going to talk about the view of regulators and how this is a big focus now. For example, just a couple of recent papers, the European Central Bank in its working paper series stated that climate change is arguably one of the biggest challenges of our time. Big statement right there. Yet, they continue, the associated risks remain poorly understood as climate shocks differ from the financial shocks observed during previous crises. So basically saying we're dealing with a very different type of risk here than we have in the past. And additionally, the Basle Committee on Banking was quoted as saying climate change may result in physical and transition risks that could affect the safety and soundness of individual banking institutions and have broader financial stability implications for the banking sector. And finally, in a European Union paper called Implication of Climate-Related Risks on Regulation of the Financial Sector, they state how to manage the emerging financial and economic risks from climate change is one of the most pressing challenges faced by central banks, financial regulators, and bank supervisors. So with that backdrop, we're going to get into some questions here with the panel. So as you heard me saying in the first couple of minutes here, the consensus of climate risk experts is that transition and physical risks represent the two most prominent threats to institutions and the broader economy. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, which of the two risks do you feel warrants more immediate focus by regulators and risk managers? Paul, would you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, and sure. And let me just put it in a little bit of perspective, because climate change is an existential risk. There are some countries and some regions that the difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, depending where we wind up, will make a difference as to whether they exist in the future or not. But let me just share with you how climate competes with a lot of other areas for the attention of not just regulators, but talk about CEOs. The Conference Board earlier this year released what we call the C-Suite Outlook, which represents a survey of 900 plus CEOs globally. I will tell you, talking about the main external threats that they see or risks they see in this coming year. Now, climate's a long-term risk, so this isn't entirely fair. Climate came in number 16. It didn't meet the top 10. And to give you a sense of what's on CEOs' minds, what's in the top 10 globally? COVID, inflation, labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, changes in consumer behavior, recession risk, global political stability, margin compression, cybersecurity, and global trade disruptions. So just keep in mind that while climate is actually connected to several of those, it's got a lot of competition. So whether climate's the #1 challenge facing the world, it might actually be global political instability and threat of war. I mean, there are plenty of other big issues that are both near-term and long-term that we're facing. So climate's in the mix. As between physical and transition risks, they're both requiring of, I think, immediate attention. I think the difference in some ways is that transition risks also come with opportunities. And so anyone who's interested in managing risk is also interested in the opportunity side, because you can think about physical risks are all the bad things that are going to happen to us physically with rising temperatures and climate change, okay, lack of biodiversity, water, drying up, all that kind of terrible stuff, right? Transition costs are the costs of getting to a greener economy. So everyone's going to incur costs, but there are lots of business opportunities there as well. So I don't know if I'd, say one is more important than the other or what requires more attention, but I do think that the transition side, if you're working at a company or somewhere else, you want to be paying attention because it's both right now. There are risks, but there are also tremendous opportunities in the transition here.
Thanks, Paul, for interesting perspective. Lisa, any thoughts on this question?
When I was thinking about this question earlier this week, I was thinking it's probably going to sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think the type of risk that you want to focus on is obviously going to be dependent on the firm. Ironically, the faster we transition to a low carbon economy, the lower the physical risk and the greater the transition risk. But the slower we drag our feet in the transition, we're really exposing ourselves to greater physical risks. And for a lot of production firms, they may have assets that are obviously going to be exposed to physical risk. Often I give the example of commercial real estate, where you actually have properties and assets that, would have be exposed to these risks that need to be mitigated. But for financial institutions, then this is going to really be dependent on the composition of their loan portfolio and how are their clients going to be impacted, which then is of interest to the regulators. In our our third annual survey of climate risk management within financial institutions, only 27% of the survey respondents ranked transition risk as one of their top priorities, but only 4% believed physical risk was their top priority. So that kind of goes back to Paul about the competing chaos.
Right. That's true. There's always challenges with emerging risks, right, where they're not fully understood
Right.
At this point. So thanks, Lisa. Teresa, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. So I would just say, kind of coming at it from a different lens, the government relations point of view, I think those are certainly two risks that are, U.S. regulators, they're on the minds of. And I think, generally regulators are looking at climate risk through the lens of their own mandate, right? So you've got banking regulators, such as the Fed, they're looking at risks, including climate, through the broader central bank lens, right? And then so you've got market regulators, such as the SEC, looking at it through their mission of protecting investors, maintaining those markets and the like. And then you turn to Capitol Hill and you've got a range of opinions about these different types of risks. You've got some Democrats who feel, that climate change absolutely poses a risk to financial institutions across the country. And then you have some Republicans, for example, who say, yeah, physical risk does not threaten financial stability here. And that, in terms of transition risk, that banks, for example, are capable of managing it. And then, of course, you have the administration. They say that our economic growth is absolutely linked to mitigating and managing both of these types of risks. I kind of share all these points just to say, from my world, from government relations, I can't say one is more pressing than the other because, generally, these are top of mind for policymakers, overall.
And Michael, if I could just offer, there are different ways. There's a line about the world is divided into two types of people, those who divide the world into two types of people and those who don't. So there are different ways of dividing risks into two. So physical and transition are common ways. Another way to think about this whole area is the risk of climate change on your the impact of climate change on your firm, right? Financial or otherwise, and your firm's impact on the climate, right? And those are two sides. And if you're in the risk world, you're probably mostly concerned about the physical and transition and the risks that climate imposes to your firm, not your firm's impact as much on climate itself. That's often for your sustainability team. But that's why I think you kind of, it's really important for risk managers to work with their sustainability colleagues as well, to make sure that they're focusing as well on the firm's impact on climate.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for those thoughts. Just moving on, somewhat related, but also different question. Given some of the predictions by regulators that I cited before, where they see climate as a threat to financial stability, and we talked a little bit already about kind of how some of these risks might develop. Timing is really a critical aspect of this, right? Because if in the end, it turns out we won't know, right, until it happens, that some of these risks either don't materialize or they don't materialize for 100 years. Well, there's probably other risks, as Paul mentioned at the outset, that warrant attention today from risk managers and others. But what are your thoughts on whether these risks are likely to materialize, or some of the risks in the very short to medium term, and therefore should be prioritized over some of the other, equally or even more, pressing risks that Paul mentioned? So, Lisa, any thoughts on that in terms of the timing?
Sure. I mean, I think we're already seeing climate risks materialize, whether it's, the physical side of the warming of the oceans and sea level rise and things like that. But going to Paul's point about transition risks and opportunities, we also, the rise of Tesla and Impossible Meat, companies like this, other disruptive business models, how far the price of renewables has the price of renewables has happened. There have been real winners and losers here, and risks are impacting financial institutions, whether they've quantified it or not. I kind of liken it to, whether or not you get on the scale after the holidays doesn't change what you weigh. It just changes whether you know about it and what you do about it. But that's one of the differences about climate risk versus other types. And I often use this in presentations as well. We may not know exactly what they are, and they probably won't be distributed evenly, but we know they're coming. And we know that the impact will be widespread. So it's sometimes a little different than, a more traditional financial risk, but I think they're already here.
Good point. Any other thoughts on that before we move on?
I think,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Teresa, please.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think kind of from the, regulators and legislators, obviously, like I said, they're looking at it from a different lens, right? They're looking at it through their markets and investors. And I think they're also looking at mitigating risks, both those that are immediate threats and those in the longer run, as Lisa was just saying. And, I think you just have to look at, there's different examples I could cite, but you've got the White House. They've taken some steps in terms of some executive orders. And I raised one that they did in May. It really set in motion kind of some of the first steps towards developing climate-related financial risk. And I raised this because they basically said, hey, federal agencies and regulators, you need to start embedding these risk considerations into things like your spending and your oversight. You have to do it now. The U.S. Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, said in a report they put out last year, this is a risk. You can't ignore it. It's going to become more serious if it's not addressed. To Lisa's point, they touched a little bit on time horizons, and they said, look, some of these impacts, they're here. They've already materialized. Some are going to manifest over a longer period of time. And I think if you kind of take a step back, and I think, Mike, you raised this in your opening, this is a fairly recent conversation, right? And especially in the US. I was reading a report before this panel, and it said about 10 years ago, environmental factors like this were either virtually unknown or were considered kind of unimportant. And over the past few years, you've seen this seismic shift. And now as you have this shift, it's certainly not without its differences. You've got on one hand, some members of FSOC who said, regardless of the impact, you need to get ready, it's coming. You have some in Congress who say, yeah, they don't believe that financial institutions, that they're at risk of failure because of it. There's really no crystal ball, but I think at the end of the day, for me and my government relations hat, it's ongoing. And in some cases, regulators are taking steps now to address those risks moving forward.
Yeah, I would just add this. Who knows the speed at which physical risks will move, but you can sort of predict to some extent the speed at which some of these transition risks will unfold. And they can come both the cost of making the transition to a low or carbon economy and not making it. So think about ExxonMobil last year. Well, they were exposed to a form of transition risk when a hedge fund holding 1% of their shares was able to team up with other investors and replace a third of their, 3 directors on the ExxonMobil board. Think about all the other companies. You've seen a rise of environmental and shareholder proposals that are passing all over the place. So, you can see the regulators, whether it's the SEC or others who are demanding action. We'll get into that, I'm sure, Teresa. But, those transition risks, whether you think of them as the cost of getting there or the cost of moving too slowly and getting there, the nice thing about them is that they do show up on your doorstep and you can see them coming. So sort of shame on anyone for not paying attention to those transition risks. The physical risks are, as you mentioned, they're harder sometimes to attribute to climate, let alone, but the transition risks are right there. So not only because of the opportunity side, but also because of the clarity side, I think that you ought to focus on, be sure at least you're focusing on those.
Thanks, Paul. That's a good segue to the next question, which is, given everyone's comments that some of these risks are already here and they're starting to manifest themselves, what are some of the most notable regulatory initiatives that have been developed in response to climate change? We'll start with Teresa on the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, and I would actually start with the administration's, their whole of government approach, right? The White House has been really vocal in framing climate change as not just this environmental risk, but also as a financial risk as well. And so President Biden's done, I think, 3, if not 4 executive orders regarding climate crises. And as I said earlier, one in May really set the motions for the first steps towards this whole of government approach. You've also have some new positions that have been created at like the SEC, the Fed, the Treasury. And I raise these because I think it shows the level of commitment to these efforts. The FSOC report that I talked about just earlier, I think it's important to highlight what the FSOC is. It's a council that's underneath the Treasury. It's actually chaired by the Treasury Secretary. So, and on the FSOC, you've got the heads of the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, others I know I'm forgetting and I shouldn't. But I think what's notable there is you have the feds of these agencies coming together saying this is a risk to financial stability and we are going to put out recommendations. That's a roadmap to help include this risk management or manage it within the system here. I do want to turn to the Fed just briefly because they've really been conducting more research in this space, and they've created a few committees. I just wanted to highlight some initiatives. They've created a supervision climate committee, so think of it as a way for the Fed to explore kind of the climate change effects to the banks under their jurisdiction. Then they also have the Financial Stability Climate Committee, FSCC. Love acronyms in this industry. And this is more focused on the committee that's looking at the broader impacts to financial stability. So one is focused on the banks and the institutions underneath their jurisdiction, as one is more of that kind of macro lens. The FSB has also done things like the Fed has also joined like the FSB's climate change activity. I think they're even spearheading a working group there. And they've joined the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a bunch of regulators globally that have gotten together to kind of share best practices regarding climate-related risk management. I mean, I could go on and on. There's efforts going on at the CFTC. There's a new chair there that I know has a focus on it. So I think we're going to start seeing even more coming out of the CFTC, certainly the SEC, which I'm sure we're going to get into later in the panel. But there's a lot going on in the US, but it's still early days. It's a lot of exploring, monitoring, trying to figure out what looks and fits and is right. But I would say things are happening in the US.
Thanks, Teresa. Lisa, would you want to comment a little bit about what some work that
Sure.
Garp is doing in this space?
Yeah, great. Through our UK office, actually, and the Garp Risk Institute, we've been working as secretariat for the Climate Financial Risk Forum's working groups on climate risk management, climate scenario analysis. The forum was established in 2019 by the UK's Financial Conduct Authority and the PRA. And its objective is to build capacity and share best practices across industry and the financial regulators in order to hopefully advance the sector's response to the financial risks that are going to stem from climate change. And it's comprised not just of people from the financial sector, obviously banks and insurers and asset managers, but we've also have observers from various trade bodies so that the forum has as broad a range of representation and really ensure that all of the output is communicated to their members. And it's very collaborative. We're not really aware of a similar grouping elsewhere. And as part of our work with the CFRF, we did a deep dive on scenario analysis in one of their more recent publications. So I just, we're on this side of the pond. I just always feel like my colleagues in Europe seem to be just a little bit ahead of us.
Thanks, Lisa. Anything you wanted to add there, Paul? Or
Yeah, I would just say that in the US, you've got regulation coming at you from every agency. If you're a public company, it's not just the upcoming disclosure rules on climate that you'll have to face, but the regulators are already coming after companies and sort of saying, well, you're telling the world all about climate in your CSR report, but you're not saying enough in your in your annual financial filings. And so there's a regulatory risk there. And talk about Europe and talk about alphabet soup. It's endless, right? But everyone I'm sure is aware of the EU taxonomy and what's coming down the pike there, where both financial firms and non-financial firms need to discuss what percentage of their business basically is aligned with how the EU defines sustainability. And financial firms are getting hit early on climate, the couple aspects of climate, more to come there soon. And of course, even more broadly than the EU taxonomy is the non-financial reporting directive, the NFRD to those who love it, which is going to be soon succeeded by the corporate sustainability reporting directive, because no one likes non-financial, they like sustainability reporting. So yeah, this entire alphabet soup that's coming at you, whether you're located in Europe or not. These things will have direct and indirect extraterritorial effects.
Thanks, Paul. Now, you've all mentioned a number of different initiatives. Do you consider these actions that are being taken so far by regulators and policymakers to be sufficient in terms of measuring emerging climate risks and helping to mitigate them? Are they kind of too late to the game? Things have progressed too far? Teresa, what's your thoughts on that from the U.S. perspective?
Yeah, I love this question. So looking at it through the U.S. policy lens, right, I think rather than considering if actions are immediate enough, I guess what I think the question is, at times, are regulators doing what they should be doing in terms of measuring these risks? And I really think you have two sides to that. And we're seeing this debated in Congress. And for example, we heard this during some recent Fed nominee hearings. If anybody had a chance to follow any of those, you had back in January, current Chair Powell, Fed Chair Powell, and current Governor Brainerd, their renomination hearings. And some on the Hill felt that Powell really hasn't been vocal enough about climate risk. And so after he was renominated, actually President Biden stated, oh, no, addressing climate risk is going to be a top priority for the Fed. And I think during recent hearings, you've heard this play out, and it's kind of this consistent theme. And so during the hearings, you heard some Democrats, basically stating, yes, it is important for the Fed to assess risks associated with climate change. And then you had some Republicans during these hearings raising concerns about further regulation in this space, or saying they have concerns with climate stress tests. And then also some members said, we actually have concerns that the FSOC put out this report stating that this is a financial stability concern. And so to these points, you had Chair Powell saying, look, the Fed's role in climate change, it's limited, right? But it is important. It's important for the banking institutions that the Fed regulates to understand these risks and manage them. And he also emphasized that they need to, and by they, the Fed, they need to view climate through the lens of the overall financial stability. Governor Brainerd, during her hearing, they were two separate hearings, by the way. During her hearing, she was, said, look, our job is to be attentive to all risks in the financial system. Large banks, you should manage your material risks. And the Fed is never going to tell banks what sectors they can or can't lend to. You also heard during the hearing, which I think is really interesting, was this kind of conversation around scenario analysis. And so Chair Powell had said, we're absolutely looking into climate scenario analysis, and it'll be different than stress tests that affect capital. Brainerd, she reiterated this point again, because there was really a lot of questions of, well, aren't they really one and the same? And there was some concern on the Republican side that was raised. But I think overall, just in terms of these two, their hearings, we really heard loud and clear, the Fed doesn't do environmental policy, but we have a responsibility to ensure that supervised institutions are properly managing risk. I do quickly, because I could talk about this forever. We only have about a half hour left, but I do quickly want to raise the other nomination hearing. It just happened earlier this month, and that was for a slate of nominees, including Sarah Bloom Raskin. And so this hearing was a bit more heated than perhaps the others. And I think, there were some Republicans who were critical of Ms. Raskin's nomination, and they raised concerns about some of her previous comments, such as comments she made that reportedly criticized the Fed for allowing oil and gas companies to have access to emergency lending facilities during the COVID pandemic. During the hearing, there was also some concerns raised about she had previously advocated for federal regulators to transition financing away from the fossil fuel industry. And Ms. Raskin said, look, it is inappropriate for the Fed to choose winners and losers. This is how she responded to it during the hearing. And she said the Fed should not favor any sector. And she, underscored that her previous comments, which were made about 2 years ago, I think, she was referring to how the Fed should run a specific relief program, but it had nothing to do with her views on how the Fed should supervise or regulate major banks. So I just kind of point these out because these hearings, there is certainly the debates going on. And I actually thought on today's panel, I could give you guys an update. Senate Banking Committee was supposed to be voting on these Fed nominees today, but they actually didn't because Republicans from the Banking Committee boycotted a scheduled vote for the nominees. And the reason that they cited was that they want more information from Ms. Raskin before they can actually proceed with the vote. So I've got nothing for you there. I just, I think my kind of going back to your question, are these steps immediate enough or, what should happen? Well, this is being discussed in DC and, on the Hill. So certainly more to come.
Thanks, Teresa. That's actually a perfect segue to the topic of doing enough or what to do. So as we've talked about the last few years, some central banks have started developing stress test methodologies or scenario analysis, all aimed at capturing the impact of climate risk on the financial system. However, for example, the ECB states that most of these proposals are still lacking certain elements that are crucial to fully assess the impact of climate change on the financial system and the real economy. So again, there's always critics, but on that point, whether or not these stress tests and scenario analysis to date are moving in the right direction or useful. Paul, do you have any perspectives on that?
Sure, I can share some. First of all, that's kind of mean of the European Central Bank because, people have only been working on this for a little while. I think the Netherlands Central Bank started this in 2018, and then France followed, and so forth, the UK and others. So it's still early days on doing climate relating stress tests, and we're very much in a learning mode, and we can get into some of the challenges if you want to in a moment. But I think there are shortcomings with all of these. I think there will always be shortcomings with all of these stress tests. But I think they're making a good faith effort. They are looking first, like in the Netherlands, they looked at transition risks over 5 years and relating just to Netherlands institutions, so forth. But, and France and the UK have gone beyond that. They're looking at 30-year time horizons and looking at both transition risks and physical risks. And every time someone does this, they're getting better. So I would just say, early days on these things, and we can talk in a moment if you want about what are going to be the ongoing challenges.
Yeah, I'm glad you continue on that thread.
Yeah. So look, these stress tests are in some ways unprecedented in what you're trying to do. So here are some of the challenges in doing a stress test. First of all, there's the long-term time horizon, especially the physical impact, the physical risks involved here. So that's a challenge. The second are data here. This isn't like where you can go back to a lot of historical data. These are, okay, what's going to happen with climate? What will be the impacts? What is going to happen in transition costs? So it's, if you're trying to get the data here, that's hard to assemble. And another challenge here is the granularity you're going to want to do, because like when France was doing theirs, it was like, oh, we do not care about the physical risks because we're kind of okay in France. It's not, climate's not going to hurt us that badly. And so you got to look at this on region. You got to look at this at industry. Modeling here is going to be really difficult. And, there's a great paper that was put up by Patrizio Badino and a colleague at the Financial Stability Institute last summer. I would recommend it to anyone. It's FSI Insights on Policy Implementation number 34, a truly sexy title, right? But I would say really look at that, because one of the challenges they talk about in modeling is, okay, first you have to figure out what are the climate events and the metrics associated with it. How does that translate to macroeconomic impacts? How does it translate to industries and geographies? And then how does it translate to financial institutions? 4 basic steps, riddled with speculation, riddled with challenges. It's going to be hard. And I would only add into the additional complexity here is you can't look at, one thing we learned in 2020, you cannot look at one set of risks in isolation. It's like the line from Henry V, when sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. You know, climate is interrelated to social risks and all other sorts of risks. So this is going to be a fun nightmare to do modeling of stress tests. Not that it shouldn't be done, but it's going to be really challenging. And I would say for policymakers, especially if they ever get to putting these in terms of capital requirements, it's going to be so important for people to understand what these tests are trying to accomplish, what they're able to accomplish, and what the assumptions are used in these stress tests. Because we've all seen what happened when people just trust the model. That's how we got the financial crisis in 2008, right? So I think, you know, we're going to really have to know the assumptions here. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thanks for those perspectives. Couldn't agree more. We have to start somewhere and need to be constructive in criticism, right? And it's, no model is perfect, including stress tests that have been out there for many years on known products. So
yeah, but it needs to be done. It needs to be tried, and we'll get better at it.
Exactly. So just moving on, another related and very important aspect of dealing with climate is the issue of transparency. IASCO, which is a global risk standard setting body, is working with a lot of organizations now to try to come up with some recommendations on that very issue and developing, you know, global consistent transparency standards. That is tricky, to say the least, when you're dealing with, you know, many different jurisdictions with different rules of their own and laws and accounting standards. But that said, you know, personally, as a credit risk manager, as I mentioned earlier, I feel it's critical that there's consistent climate-related disclosures are developed in the near term, because without that, folks like myself and my staff really don't have the data we need to do an informed analysis and to assess, for example, what risk is building up at any particular financial institution. So, you know, as a question, what can you tell us about how the US regulators and policymakers are prioritizing the topic of transparency for US financial institutions? And I'll go back to you with this one, Teresa, to start.
Yeah, sure, happy to. And I'm happy to raise some. I know there's many others out there, but I'll focus on just a few this evening. So in terms of the US SEC, we've certainly seen more focus from them on climate-related disclosures, right? This has been going on for a bit of time. About a year ago, I think she was acting chair leave, and she's commissioner leave, but she was acting chair of the SEC for a period of time. When she was acting chair, she directed the SEC to begin looking at guidance that it put out in 2010 on climate disclosures. And she basically said, it's 10 years old. A lot has happened then. Maybe we need to look at these and see, do they need to be updated and, you know, frankly, kicked up a notch. And so there was a request for public comment that was put out, and it looked for public input on things like what info related to climate risks can be, you know, quantified and measured, and should disclosures be included in annual reports, periodic filings, you know, how should the SEC best regulate and monitor this space? Chair Gensler came into the SEC recently, and he confirmed right from the start that this is a priority of his to continue as well. And so he basically said that he was looking for a rule proposal to come out, supposed to come out late last year. It didn't. It hasn't come out yet. We're not really sure on timing, but to be specific, we know, and the SEC has been very clear that they are anticipating putting out a proposal for mandatory climate risk disclosures for public companies. And so the chair indicated that this disclosure will include both qualitative measures, so think things like how companies' leadership might manage climate-related risks. Also included might be quantitative things. So think things like metrics related to greenhouse gas emissions or, you know, other financial impacts of climate risk. You know, Chair Gensler also said to his staff, maybe you should consider, or, you know, please consider whether there should be certain metrics for specific industries. So for example, maybe certain metrics that are specific to the banking industry or the insurance sector. You know, again, we haven't seen this proposal come out, so I can't really speak to what is actually going to be in there. I do want to point out, you might have read, there were some media articles recently about a debate amongst some Democrats within the commission regarding this proposal. And according to this coverage, kind of the debate focuses on two things. One, how much information the SEC could actually ask companies to disclose without kind of getting tripped up with legal challenges. And the second thing is, should auditors sign off on these disclosures? And I raise this because, the proposal, when it's actually put out, it can only move forward. It can only be put out for public comment when it gets a majority vote within the commission. So right now you have the chair and you have 2 Democratic commissioners, and then there's 1 Republican commissioner who will not, support this proposal. So in order for this proposal to get out for public comment, you're going to need all 3 Democrats to support it. I'll also say what's interesting is Congress is absolutely keeping an eye on the SEC disclosure efforts. There was a letter that was sent to Chair Gensler last week from Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she basically said, hey, what's going on with these eternal debates? And, clock's a ticking, get this proposal out there. We need it to start. So, there's certainly a lot going on about disclosures at the SEC. I do want to raise Congress for a minute here because there are some lawmakers on the Hill that are making efforts to advance disclosure efforts as well. In fact, in June, the House passed legislation that would require the SEC to have these climate risk disclosures. And it narrowly passed the House. It was basically a party line vote. And then also on the Senate side, there was a companion bill that was introduced. I think these efforts are interesting because they happened around the same time as the SEC request for comment. So perhaps they're a bit of a messaging or optics move, but it absolutely shows congressional support for these activities. You might say, all right, Teresa, well, it passed in the House. What is it going to do in the Senate? It's probably not going to go anywhere anytime soon. You may remember it's midterm election season. So that means that any bills that aren't must-dos or don't have wide bipartisan support, they're not likely to move forward. For the simple fact, lawmakers are, those who are up for re-election, they're working on their campaign. There's a lot of other climate-related bills, right? But these are the ones, I just wanted to raise given their disclosure, focus there. Of course, there's varying views. There's some Republicans who say, they flat out oppose any ESG reporting rules. They say that it could be burdensome, costly for companies, and it could also discourage some companies from going public if they are then held to those types of reporting requirements. I don't know, certainly more to come in the GR space really regarding disclosures and transparency in general.
Well, it's definitely comforting to see that at least a lot of rigorous discussion and debate is happening. And it's
Absolutely.
That's great to hear. Just moving over to Lisa, how can central banks account for climate risks in their monetary operations, things like credit easing policies, collateral policies, or even asset purchases?
Part of the question I think might be, or some might ask, is should central banks account? Or because one of the things, actually, I was just reading a recent survey by the NGFS on this topic, and they had said that only a quarter of all central bank mandates reviewed explicitly mentioned anything related to sustainability as part of the central bank objectives, and only 5% had it, as a primary objective. So again, they're not necessarily focusing on it. And Teresa touched a little bit on this earlier when talking about the Fed and picking winners and losers and things like that, because obviously central bank mandates, they may have a different time horizon. They may be looking at the medium term versus some climate related issues may have a longer term horizon. And going back again to one of Teresa's earlier comments, again, while you don't want to pick winners or losers, it can definitely be argued that working towards, a net zero financial system makes sense, strategically for the central bankers and the supervisors, to minimize the risks to the macro economy and the stability of the financial system. But they also want to be, coherent and in coordination with whatever government policies are being established as well. Some of the respondents to this particular survey done by the NGFS, God, all these acronyms, they mentioned the risk of creating financial distortions as a possible obstacle to really actively greening their monetary policy operations. Again, kind of picking winners and losers. And some respondents noted that the demand for green assets, and I know we were going to be talking about green finance, currently exceeds supply. And so they're saying, well, then the central bank doesn't need, to support this asset class necessarily if the market's doing it on its own. But I was reading an interesting example, and it's kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, about the Bank of England. They have announced plans to, in managing its corporate bond purchase program, that they're going to use a climate scorecard. that's going to evaluate the bond issuer's climate performance and kind of tilt its purchases towards companies that are stronger climate performers. And of course, there are critics. Everybody's mean. And they said, the greening strategy has two limitations. There's no introduction of any substantial penalties for poor climate performers. So you're kind of using the carrot and not the stick. And some say, oh, no, you need to use the stick more. And then again, Bank of England has also said they're committed to market neutrality, which, even though this kind of has an inherent carbon bias. And so the critics are saying this is going to restrict the bank's ability to, reduce its involvement in carbon intensive activities within its scheme. So some have argued that they need to go even further and reallocate and really, go with the greener companies if they're going to do anything. So again, they're making the attempt and still being criticized, but it is one way that they have been looking at it.
Mike, if I could just jump in really fast. So the conference board recently put out a report saying U.S. consumers want business to do more on sustainability. I only mention that because it's got a really interesting chart in it that shows the delta between what U.S. consumers think about the federal and state government and what they think about different industries and what they're doing in sustainability, including environmental, but not limited to environmental sustainability, and the amount of change they need to make. The federal and state governments show up decently in the 40% range on saying, hey, you're doing something good, but there's a huge gap. They're 76%, they need to change a lot. So that's the government. But every industry is also listed there. And which are the industries with the biggest gap? Airlines, hotels, clothing manufacturers, right? Tech people think is doing okay and it's got a moderate gap. But so my only point is that as we're focusing on the regulators, it's up to all industries to do their part here. And so I don't think there's going to be, a silver bullet. Like literally every industry's got to be playing its part here. And I think it's a mistake to rely too heavily on the central bankers to guide this. At least that's a U.S. consumer standpoint.
That's a great point, Paul, and actually kind of segues to the next question I was going to raise. There's obviously we've been spending a lot of time here talking about new policies and regulations, kind of pushing down to firms that you must do this, right? But what incentives could be put out there for businesses to reduce their exposures and carbon footprints, to have this more of a partnership, right? To have firms say, this is the right thing to do. And by the way, in doing the right thing, I'll also, derive some benefit from that for my company. Is there anything you wanted to touch on there, Lisa, from your standpoint?
Sorry, I forgot I muted. Actually, in talking about consumer demand, our climate risk management survey sort of bore out those kind of results as well. The financial institutions that we surveyed, 2/3 of them have already altered existing products, where they're converting funds into ESG or more green funds, or they're reducing financing to coal-fired power stations, things of that nature, in response to consumer demand, which seems to be incentivizing them quite nicely. There's been a great deal of product innovation reported by our survey respondents as well. And actually, ironically, the increased demand for these sort of products was cited as a short-term concern by our survey respondents in being able to properly structure and meet that demand. So that is one incentive. But I do think one of the keys will be a suitable tax on carbon. Getting carbon tax, getting it priced. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to really make the necessary progress to decarbonize, as some of the existing regulatory incentives, as we might call them, aren't working well enough. Otherwise, you may have a situation where you have brown assets leaving the balance sheets of the regulated banks, and they have to go somewhere. And so we're not really sure, if they're in private equity or somewhere where they're not being regulated. You get that question a lot. Do you engage and act, as an activist investor, or do you divest? So that's the downside, I think.
That's very helpful. Just shifting gears slightly to the topic of corporate governance, which is also something that's showing up more and more in a lot of these new policy documents that are coming out. To what extent are you seeing boards and C-suite management roles being more and more responsible directly for managing climate risk? Are most firms taking a strategic approach, or are most firms still kind of dealing with climate risk on more of an ad hoc basis when they kind of need to, or some particular risk arises? Paul, you want to kick off that discussion?
Yeah, it really varies by industry and by size of company. So again, Conference Board recently put out a report. You think that's all we do. We actually do things other than put out reports. But we did put one out on sustainability disclosure practices. And it's really interesting to see, when we talk about strategic, 87% of S&P 500 companies have a climate policy. That's pretty good, right? Under a third of the broader Russell 3000 do. So it really drops down. Look at climate risk. Basically 54% of S&P 500 companies, but only 54% have disclosures in the annual reports on climate risk. Only a third of mid-caps do. Greenhouse gas emissions, the gap between large and small is even greater. 71%, or sorry, actually do this, 84% of companies over 50 billion address greenhouse gas emissions. When you're getting down to the smaller companies, it's like 3%. So big gap between small and large in terms of how they're addressing this. It varies greatly by industry. 74% of utilities are disclosing climate risk. Note, only 11% of healthcare firms, which is a big focus at Glasgow, are disclosing climate risk. So it really varies. There is not one size fits all. That's a cliche, right? But each board is going to have to grapple with this separately in their own way. There's a lot of investor pressure to do so, a lot of employee pressure, a lot of customer pressure to do so. So many boards, if they haven't already gotten on the bandwagon, will get on the bandwagon, but it's hard. And this is actually not something that's going to be driven at the board level, I think. Honestly, it's got to be driven at the management level. Your CEO, your CFO in particular, has to embrace this. And the member of the C-suite that is farthest behind the curve on caring about climate and sustainability is typically your CFO. In that C-suite outlook survey we did, CEOs ranked sustainability as the seventh highest priority that they had. CFOs ranked it 10th. Heads of HR rated it 3rd. So your CEO has a lot of work to do to get the financial apparatus, including risk management, to address sustainability as a core competency for finance. We'll get into sustainability bonds and green bonds. So there are real opportunities there. But within corporate America, at least, finance and strategy are actually a little bit behind a lot of their colleagues in the C-suite on this. So I hope that gives you your folks who are watching at least some data to work with.
Yeah, those are some great data points. Very interesting. Anything to add there, Lisa?
Yeah, actually, our 2021 survey results, which is focusing on financial organizations, of course, we're definitely seeing that the board of directors are endeavoring to get up to speed on these issues. Among our respondents, about 90% reported that their board is reviewing climate-related papers, proposals, and things of this nature being brought up on a quarterly basis. This is up from 70% when we first did this study or the survey in 2019. The common topic they're discussing is climate change itself, but then followed by transition risk and then alignment, whether their businesses and portfolios are going to be aligned with a certain pathway. Here at Garp, we're actually working on a project to look at what a climate dashboard might look like for a board to use. It's very early days. You know, a lot of firms don't have the right data. Paul mentioned this, the level of granularity you need, you know, carbon emissions for all your counterparties and through the whole portfolio. Any kind of a dashboard like that really will need a bit of a IT investment to sort of make it repeatable. So everybody's, you know, kind of waiting to see before they, you know, want to escalate that. But we're also seeing that, excuse me, that the responsibility for climate-related risk management is being split across several executives. Generally, the head of sustainability, they must have heard you, Paul. You got to work with your sustainability people. The chief risk officer, the CEO, the chief operating officer, and the chief investment officer. And guess which one I didn't mention, Paul? The chief financial officer. So you must have been reading our results too.
Yeah, I don't read your mail, I promise.
Thanks, Lisa. No, that's really interesting perspectives. We're going to move on to our last topic for the panel, which is to talk a little bit about green bonds, which has become a bit of a phenomenon in the last few years. Basically, these are bonds used by companies to raise funds for environmentally friendly or green projects. In 2020, green bond issuance exceeded 290 billion, and from what I understand, continues to grow. That said, there's also been criticisms of green bonds that different levels of disclosure, varying quality of disclosure among issuers. The performance of the bonds hasn't been on par with some other similar rated instruments. So we want to talk a little bit about these instruments since they are becoming more and more popular. What are some of the ways that corporations or governments can help ensure that financing associated with green bonds is solely being used on environmentally friendly projects, which has been one of the criticisms that not all the money is going to such endeavors. Lisa, do you want to kick off that topic?
Sure. As sustainable finance and investments, as these products proliferate, you really need harmonized definitions, especially in light of cross-border finance. You want, in one location and the other to mean the same thing. And a lot of this so far has really been satisfied, I think, from a bottom-up approach from the market participants coming together through industry associations to look at voluntary guidelines and frameworks, but there's also a growing regulatory involvement in the area, which I'm sure Teresa could speak to, an example Paul mentioned earlier is the EU taxonomy, where you're not really looking at the financial products or the disclosures, but what is the underlying activity? What is it at the end of the day? And looking at regulators are trying to create now specific definitions of sustainable activities. And the EU taxonomy is actually an example of that. And it's setting these thresholds for various economic activities by sector and subsector. And then it doesn't care what the financial instrument is or how you're funding it. It's like, what are you doing with it? Whether it's a loan or a bond or project financing, as long as it's a recognized green activity according to this taxonomy, it would be sustainable. And according to the taxonomy, to be green, the activities have to make a substantive contribution to either one of 6 environmental objectives: climate change mitigation, adaptation, sustainable use and production of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy. I find the circular economy fascinating. Pollution prevention and control, and the protection and restoration of biodiversity. And so, if you meet those things, then you would be seen as a green activity. But there's a real debate cited between, do gas and nuclear power have any place in the taxonomy? So some of these decisions are, a little bit politicized, and that makes things difficult at best.
Thanks, Lisa. And for our last question, Teresa, can you talk a little bit about any work being done around standardization of disclosures in the US?
Yeah, sure. So make sure I'm off mute. Yeah. So I guess what I'll say is kind of coming at, the green space, I would say from the regulators, they're taking steps to make sure investors have information to make those decisions, right? And so I'll talk about it a little bit, the SEC steps for marketing of green funds. So it's not quite the bonds what Lisa was talking about, but, per Chair Gensler, there's a lot of funds that market themselves as sustainable or green and the like, as Lisa was referring to. And I've heard Chair Gensler say this many times. It's like when you walk into a grocery store, you see something low fat. How do you know it's low fat? And so, for many years, the SEC has had rules to govern the naming of funds. And so, in fact, if you're a registered fund name, such as it would apply to current, sustainable focus funds, you are actually subject to anti-fraud provisions of certain federal securities laws. You are actually prohibited from using words that are deceptive or misleading in the name of your fund. In fact, fun fact I found out before this panel was the SEC names rule actually requires funds to have 80% of their assets in terms of like the investment type or the industry that your name suggests. So the chair has been focused on this and has asked staff to consider to update the current name rules and enhance disclosures so that investors can see what the data, the methodology, and the criteria are behind those claims. So, as we understand it specifically, SEC staff are looking at evaluating requirements for both registered funds, so what's kind of behind those labels, and also for investment advisors, because, they put out their ESG investment strategies, are they actually following what they put out there? Are they, following what they have specified with their clients? So the SEC is looking into, potentially putting out proposals around these. Please don't ask me when, we have no clue. It may come out with the disclosure proposal, who knows? But we do know that it's a focus that Chair Gensler has asked the staff to prioritize. So certainly something's coming out at some point, which I find fascinating. I look forward to reading all these when they come out.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for you. So that's really encouraging to see that the SEC is on top of this and going to ensure that investors, have a level playing field and have the information that they need. All right. Well, I'm just looking at a list of questions here. I think we've gotten through everything just about on time. I don't see any questions in the queue from the audience, so I'm assuming we answered everybody's questions on climate risk they ever wanted to know. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending and listening to the panel. Hopefully you found it interesting, discussion around this interesting new topic, and one that's sure to be around for a long time and sure to have more conversations in the future. I also want to thank all the panelists for taking time from their busy schedules to participate. And with that, I'll say good evening to everybody. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.